Manoj Jain, and with my colleague Dr. Mark Musi, we're having a conversation about how mindfulness can transform us. Specifically, we've been talking about how mindfulness can lead to spiritual upliftment. This is a topic of great interest to many. Many who are very religious wonder if the practice of meditation can lead to a more spiritual life. Also, those of us who are in the scientific arena have talked about meditation and mindfulness in ways that it has no relationship to religion. So, Mark, I want to begin this conversation about the relationship of spirituality and secularization of mindfulness. What are your thoughts on this?
Excellent question, and I have many. As we've noted in our presentations, the practice of meditation and mindfulness have their roots in what we might call religion or spirituality, particularly the traditions emerging out of India, but we've also seen that these practices are also embedded very deeply into some of the Western religious traditions. We've chosen the word spirituality rather deliberately, and you may have heard an expression that has gained currency in the last couple of decades, which is spiritual but not religious. And so in the minds of a lot of people, they wonder, what is the difference between spirituality and religion? Can you be spiritual and not religious? One of the things I do want to emphasize here is that the practice of meditation does not depend upon your religion. So you can consider yourself religious or non-religious, secular, or someone that practices a religious tradition and still find great benefit in the practice of mindfulness. So that's the first thing I want to say.
Right, and I want to emphasize that point. Many people still have a misconception that meditation is an Eastern, somewhat mystical practice, and in fact, those of us in science know very well that it's a practice. It does have roots in an Eastern and in Western religion tradition. However, it's a practice just like a practice of jogging or a practice of exercising by weightlifting, which is beneficial to us and our benefit in our human body, as well as in our wellness and so many other ways that we've talked about.
Still, however we define religion and however we define secularization, people might wonder, is meditation a spiritual practice?
Yes.
And I think different people might come down differently on that particular question. Now, I happen to favor the idea of thinking of meditation as a spiritual practice, but not necessarily as a religious one. One of my favorite books is called The Little Book of Atheist Spirituality, written by the French philosopher André Comte-Sponville. And in this book, Comte-Sponville says that even atheists have a spirituality. They just don't accept belief in God, but they still have spirits and they still have a need to kind of develop their interior lives. And interestingly, in this text, much of what he talks about in terms of developing an atheist spirituality involves some of the practices that we would call mindfulness and meditation. But my point is, it's a linguistic matter in a lot of ways. We want to maintain the idea that whatever it is that we practice in meditation or mindfulness is something that can be practiced regardless of what your theological convictions are.
So this concept of a particular theological perception that one may have or conviction that they may have, and that meditation relates to each one of these various traditions. Tell us about the Western traditions, how one can practice mindfulness and meditation for spiritual upliftment in the Christian or the Judaic or the Islamic traditions.
In my presentation, I talk a good bit about the way different Western traditions have embodied the mindfulness practices. I also mentioned that those traditions tend to submerge or downplay the mindfulness and meditative dimensions. This is particularly true in something like Protestantism, which focuses a great deal on doctrine and belief. But if you look deeply within all of these traditions, there are things that we can easily identify as practices that are intended to encourage our sense of stillness, our sense of rest, our sense of calmness. Some people might call that prayer, but prayer doesn't necessarily have to involve words. If you think of prayer as addressing yourself to God, then that perhaps is not exactly what we mean by meditation, but there are forms of prayer, such as centering prayer and contemplative prayer in the Christian tradition, that is virtually indistinguishable from the practice of mindfulness.
So, as a philosopher and as a teacher of global world religions, let me ask you this. When we take mindfulness and we make it secular, do we lose something?
Well, I think we do. And others, of course, might disagree with this particular perspective. I think one of the great problems of secularizing mindfulness has been the tendency to de-emphasize its rootedness in an ethical tradition. Now, in our course, we haven't spent a great deal of time talking about ethics and about various practices that one would regard as moral. But in virtually all the religious traditions that teach mindfulness, an ethical practice is essential to a mindful practice. In fact, the two really can't be separated. So, for instance, within Buddhism, before one even begins to practice meditation, you take certain precepts. You promise not to harm other beings. You promise not to steal, not to lie, not to take intoxicants, and so forth. And these are seen as benefiting the practice of mindfulness. So, for instance, to drink liquor in a Buddhist tradition would really be to contribute to the very opposite of mindfulness, because being intoxicated or drinking alcohol or engaging in any kind of substance use that clouds the mind, that fogs the mind, is actually counterproductive to what you're seeking in mindfulness.
So, Mark, I have to talk to you about my medical perspective, and so the medical part of me who speaks to this topic. And it relates to this fact that I am completely comfortable with secularizing mindfulness as a exercise or an activity, even leaving the ethics issue out. And I think in ways that might be a stepping stone, that many people may not be willing to accept the ethical aspects. And if we just look at the core basic practice, the practice which would be no different than, as we've talked about, weightlifting or biking or walking, the breathing exercises that mindfulness practices, the meditation practices offer, we can utilize them for our benefit. And if we wish to add the ethics, we can use the ethics to make us even better. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm of two minds of this idea. First of all, I think there has been great benefit in the secularization of mindfulness. Now, more people than ever have heard about the practices of meditation, have incorporated it into their lives, and have benefited by it. So I think that's wonderful. The two minds that I have come about from this perspective. First of all, I know that within the spiritual traditions out of which meditation arises, make ethical practice essential. That's one thing. And so there's part of me that wants to say, yeah, we've got to do the ethical dimension as well, and you've got to practice non-harming, and you can't steal and lie and so forth, because those go against what we're seeking to actualize in a mindfulness practice. On the other hand, to approach it in the way that you suggest and kind of abstract or bracket out the whole ethical practice is still a way of getting people to practice mindfulness. And so my belief, my hope, my conviction might be to practice mindfulness might actually bring them to the ethical dimension, to the ethical practice that I think other traditions want to sort of place at the beginning. Good. So it's really kind of a question of, is it going to be the foundation of the practice, or is it going to be an outcome? And since I see mindfulness and ethics as being dialectically related, it's almost a moot question about where you start.
Sure. Well, this has been a very helpful conversation to talk about how mindfulness can transform us in becoming more spiritual, with or without the ethics. So now we've concluded all of the various transformations that mindfulness helps us achieve, everything from well-being to insight to compassion and now to spiritual upliftment as well as greater wisdom. Next, we will be talking about how mindfulness can lead to happiness, something that we all seek.